All right, so in order to use user default, we have to create a brand new object. So let's call it defaults, and we'll set it to equal user defaults, which is an interface to the user's defaults database where you store key value pairs persistently across launches of your app. That's exactly what we want. So let's hit user default, and we're going to set up a standard user default. So now that we've got that set up, we can go down to the part where we add a new item to our to-do list, and we append it to our item array, which is this thing here. Now what we can do is we can save that updated item array to our user defaults. And we can do that in a single line of code by writing defaults.set. And we're going to use value for key, which takes any object. And in this case, it's going to be an array, or rather self.item array, because remember, we're inside a closure here. And the key is going to identify this array inside our user defaults. So let's call it to-do list array. And of course, because we're inside a closure, we have to add self to our defaults as well and see if it works. All right, let's go ahead and add a new item. Hit add item, shows up in our table view. But as you'll see, if I delete our app and reopen it again, it does not show up. And the reason is not because our code didn't work or that we didn't manage to save our item array into our defaults. The reason is because we haven't used our saved item to load up the table view. It's still getting all of that data from our item array, which does not persist, remember? But we can actually view our data inside our user defaults, and we can prove that the data has been saved. Now, user defaults get saved in a plist file, and that's why everything you put in there has to be a key value pair. So you always need a key that you're going to use to retrieve the item, and then you add the value. It could be anything. It could be an array, it could be a dictionary, string, any data type in there. And you can grab it back using this key. So how can we find our user defaults file so that we can see our data? In order to do that, we need to grab the file path of our sandbox that our app runs. We need to get the ID of the simulator, and we also need the ID of the sandbox where our app lives in. Now, it sounds a little bit complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Let's go into our app delegate at the did finish launching with options delegate method, which we know always gets called. And here we're going to write a little bit of code in order to print out the path for our user defaults file. Now, at this point, if you want to follow along with me and see this file path, make sure that you ran your app inside the simulator and not a physical device, and also that you've added a new item to your table view. So let's go ahead and print this search path. So it's ns search path for directories in domains, and the directory is the document directory, and the domain mask is the user domain mask, and expand tilde will go for true. And then we're going to get the last item in this array, and we're going to print it as a string. Now, don't worry too much about this line. I'm just using it to print and to prove to you that our data has been saved somewhere, even though it's not showing up. So let's run our app again. And as soon as our app launches, we can see this file path here. Now we can use that file path to go into our Finder and try and locate this plist file that stores our data. So this starts off in our root, which is our Macintosh hard drive. And then we're supposed to go into users, and this is my username on this laptop. And then we're going to go into library, developer, core simulator, devices, and we have to search for this 8D49, looks like that one. So this is the device ID. So this is called a UUID. and it identifies our device uniquely. So that could be our simulated device, or it could be a physical device. So this corresponds to this particular simulator instance that I've got launched here. And then I have to go into data, containers, data again, application, and then I have to search for the application. And that refers to the unique ID of this To-Doey application that I've launched earlier on, where I saved my data. So now we're entering the sandbox, essentially. And this is going to be called E5. So let's look for something that is E5. Now, a much easier way to do this would actually be sorting this or searching it, but I found it right there. So E50. This is basically our app To-Doey. Now, it would be easier if they called it To-Doey, but then that wouldn't be unique. So here's our app sandbox. And once you've gotten here, you're going to look inside library and preferences. And now, finally, you get to your plist. And if we expand it, you can see that it says com.londonappery.todoey.plist. Now, if we double click on it, it'll open by default inside Xcode, and you'll see that we have this key that we used earlier on where we said save it under the key to-do list array here, that's the key, and the value is an array. So Swift is clever enough to figure out that our item, the data type, was an array data type, and if we expand this, we can see that there's 4 items in there, and our latest item was in fact saved. So why is it not showing up in our table view? Well, it's because we haven't used it to retrieve the data. Now, all we need to do in order to retrieve our data is we can go into View Did Load, and we can set our item array to equal the array inside our user defaults. So item array equals defaults dot array for key. And the key is, of course, to-do list array. Let's just double check because it's a hard-coded key. Just make sure that it's exactly spelled the same. Yeah, looks good. And we're going to cast this as an array of strings. So that's all very well and good if our to-do list array actually exists. But if it doesn't, then our app is probably going to crash. So to prevent this, instead, we can write this as a if let items equals defaults.array for key as array of strings. And if that works, then let's say item array is now equal to items, and we can get rid of that force downcast, make it an optional. So now let's run our app and see if it works. Well, hey, so our last item that we saw inside the plist now exists inside our table view, and also if I add any new items, then it also shows up in our table view. And you can see it appear both in the user default plist as well as when we terminate our app and reopen it. So that was a quick intro into how we can use user defaults to persist data. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about user defaults in a little bit more detail and talk about which scenarios and situations should you be using this. So all of that and more on the next lesson. See you there.